Hi everyone. I want to start by thanking you for joining us on this platform. My colleague, Mr. Wissam Sharafuddin, and I would like to welcome you in the name of the Arab American Center for Culture and Arts to this new episode of the program History of Arab Israeli Conflict, which had been presented since more than a year now, just a little bit after the start of the Israeli genocide in Gaza. This new episode is titled Witnessing a Genocide Exploring Arab Americans' Mental Health, with guest speakers Dr. Nadia Dajani and Dr. Yara Mikawi, both assistant professors at University of Louisville. Welcome. Before we proceed, we are showing you short video and reel of pictures from Gaza. Look well at what you are seeing. Let me just start by asking this question, quick question. What would you do when you see such videos and pictures? What would you think? What would you feel? How do you react? Knowing that it's not the same to be in the picture or to be watching it. It's not the same to be the victim or the spectator. So, what about those victims who are in the pictures, in front of the cameras? Those who experienced intensely the genocide, those who were killed, starved to death, humiliated, terrified, horrified, traumatized, victimized, brutalized, holocaustized. And on the other hand, we as Arab Americans are witnessing terrible moments since the genocide started. I don't think that our life would be the same as it used to be. It can never be the same again. We cannot watch all these atrocities committed by Israeli rejoicing soldiers against innocent children and mothers, against humanity, without feeling deep anger rising within. You cannot see news reels showing massacres against civilians and then go to sleep peacefully. After seeing these homeless families fleeing from massacres, moving around from place to place, hoping to find a safe shelter, but to face another massacre, how could you sleep peacefully? How could someone feel the need to eat after watching babies die due to starvation? These questions are harsh and severe and disastrous because what's going on in Gaza and Lebanon is harsh and severe and disastrous. We, as Arab Americans, look around and see an ongoing genocide at home while nobody all over the free world, the civilized world, almost nobody cares. Not this only. We see this same civilized and free Western world supporting the killers with huge arsenals and armaments, with artilleries and killing weapons, and justifying what they are doing under that stupid, ignorant logo that Israel had the right to defend itself. But what about the Palestinians who were wiped out of their homeland more than 7 decades ago? Don't they have the right to defend their rights? Nobody cares. We really feel that our lives aren't this important. We feel neglected. We feel abandoned by the whole wide world and including our own Arab world. And in certain moments of agony, we have the same feelings of those we watched in the videos and pictures. In some moments, we feel that we become a part of those pictures. We jump into the pictures. We feel just like those victims in the pictures. We feel traumatized and terrorized and humiliated and brutalized just like them. So, what do we do? What would be the consequences of all this on us, and mainly on our mental health? This is the main topic in this episode. I will give the platform now to my colleague Wissam Sharafuddin to introduce our guest speakers. Wissam. Wissam, it's your turn. Yes, Wissam. Unmute, Wissam.
Sorry, yes. Continue, doctor. I think we got glitched a little bit.
No, I just finished. I said I introduced,
Okay.
and I gave you the platform to introduce our guest speaker.
Okay, thank you very much. Then the glitch is from my side. Thank you very much, Ambassador Dr. Ali Ajami, for this introduction. I have the pleasure and honor today to introduce two Arab American scholars from University of Louisville. We have with us Dr. Yara Makawi. She's an Egyptian American licensed psychologist, co-founder of the DEAR Project, and assistant professor at the University of Louisville. After completing her primary education in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Oman, she earned her bachelor's degree in applied psychology at the University of Illinois Chicago and her doctorate in clinical and community psychology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her work focuses on understanding the impact of racism on the mental health and identifying effective strategies to increase anti-racism. Welcome, Yara. And we also have with us Dr. Nadia Al-Jijani. She graduated with a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Toronto. She is currently assistant professor at the University of Louisville. Her research examines momentary risk and protective factors of suicidal thoughts. In more recent work, she is investigating these processes in individuals of diverse background, including Arab Americans. Ultimately, she hopes that her work will inform future prevention and intervention efforts. The work of Dr. Dijani and Dr. Mikawi is very fresh, is very recent, and is very relevant. We actually waited for them to finish the research so we can present it, and we could not wait longer to present this breaking research. We in Dearborn, as I was talking with Dr. Yara and Dr. Nadia before the program, we are living what they have done research about. We feel it. We know that there's something going on. We are waiting for research to inform us more on what are we experiencing as Arab Americans, and hopefully more research will be done on how to cope with it in all our ages, from my children to my parents. We are all experiencing shared trauma. For more about that, Dr. Yara and Dr. Nadia will be presenting their research now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for those introductions. Hopefully you can all hear me okay.
Yes, perfect.
Great, thank you. So we are really excited to be presenting our preliminary work looking at the mental health effects of witnessing a genocide in Arab Americans. As Wissam and Dr. Ajami noted, we are Arab Americans as well. I am Palestinian originally. I was born in Jordan. And so a lot of this work was inspired by our own experiences over this year. And we really felt a sense of urgency in exploring this as soon as possible to better understand what are the experiences of Arab Americans as they are exposed to genocide live stream. All right, next slide, please. All right. So as Dr. Ajami put so eloquently, we have been witnessing the acceleration of the ongoing genocide in Gaza for over 1 year now. In that year, over 40,000 have been killed. And this is a conservative estimate. Many of those killed are women and children, over 100,000 injured. And each of these numbers is a whole story. Of course, we are not just numbers. It's a whole universe that's gone, leaving behind it unimaginable grief for those closest to the ones that we lost in this most brutal way. Next slide. Great. Over the same year, we've also witnessed the destruction of Gaza, making the enclave virtually unlivable. With 80% of housing units destroyed, 80% of commercial facilities damaged, 68% of the croplands damaged, and 87% of school buildings damaged. Some have called this ecocide and scholasticide, along with genocide. The ramifications of the destruction will be felt for years to come, as it will take decades to rebuild Gaza. But inshallah, we really do hope that we will rebuild it even better than it was before. Next slide. Now, more recently, we have seen the expansion of the genocide into Lebanon. We're seeing the same blueprint that was applied in Gaza now in Lebanon, with over 2,000 killed and at least 11,000 injured. In all of this death and destruction, we have witnessed through our devices, live streamed for the world to see. We have watched this every single day, often multiple times a day. We expose ourselves to the ongoing trauma of the Palestinian people because we recognize them as part of our community and our family. And we realize that we hold immense privilege given where we currently live. Nothing will really be like the pain of actually living through the genocide. Of course, we also owe a huge debt to the dedicated journalists on the ground, risking their lives to show us the brutal reality of the genocide in Gaza, the expansion of it in Lebanon, and the ongoing and forced displacement in the West Bank. Bearing witness to the Palestinian struggle for liberation is crucial, as Dr. Ajami noted as well. And bearing witness may also come at a cost. Now, much of the research that has explored the impact of violence exposure on mental health has specifically focused on the effects of exposure or witnessing community violence, so violence in one's neighborhood, and that effect on children, adolescents, and young adults. In prior work, one study that combined 114 studies altogether found that witnessing violence in one's neighborhood and community led to greater, what's often called externalizing problems. So things like abusing substances or perpetrating violence in children and adolescents specifically. In another study focused on urban women, women who witnessed violent acts in their neighborhoods were twice as likely to experience more depression and anxiety in comparison to those who did not. Few studies have explored the impact of hearing about genocide, which is the closest that we could find in terms of not living through but directly witnessing a genocide. In one recent investigation, however, Sinalo and colleagues found that both private conversations about the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda and public conversations and commemorations of the genocide were associated with poorer mental health in children. And so this really highlights the impact of hearing about genocide even decades later and its impact on mental health. However, there's a lot that we don't know. So despite there being some evidence that general exposure is associated with worse mental health, we don't know whether exposure to genocide content live streamed, as we are currently experiencing, is associated with worse mental health outcomes for Arab Americans specifically. We also don't know about what factors might protect against the harmful impacts of exposure to genocide on mental health, which is crucially important as we bear witness to the ongoing genocide in Gaza and now expanded into Lebanon. Oh, Yara, you're muted. Sorry, Dr. McCowie.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you so much for that critical background, Dr. Eldajani. So like Dr. Eldajani has shared, there's some initial work out there, but there's a lot that we don't know. So in the study that we'll be talking about today, we hope to address just a couple of these gaps in our knowledge. So our first goal was to answer the question, what is the impact of exposure to genocide content on Arab American mental health? And specifically, does more exposure to genocide content, so all of this content that Dr. Eldajani has been talking about, as well as Dr. Ajami and Wissam, is this related to greater severity in depression, traumatic stress symptoms, and also suicidal thoughts? So our prediction, of course, which is not going to be surprising to you, was that more exposure was going to be associated with more suicidal thoughts, more depression, and more traumatic stress symptoms. And of course, we are a diverse community as Arab Americans, and we all differ in important ways that might be relevant for mental health. So we also wanted to know which of these differences can make it so that this exposure isn't as related to worse mental health. So in other words, we wanted to know, does the degree to which exposure is associated with mental health depend on other factors? So specifically, does a feeling of belonging to the Arab American community, or does higher levels of activism influence how tightly linked exposure to genocide content is with all of these mental health symptoms that we're interested in? So what we expected was that for people with a high sense of belonging and who engaged in more activism, exposure to genocide might be less associated with outcomes. So we expected this belongingness and this activism to play a protective role for Arab Americans' mental health. So to answer our questions, we recruited a sample of Arab Americans. And so this data collection occurred in May, and we used a service called Qualtrics Panel, which helped us identify Arab Americans who completed the study. So we had a total of 418 Arab Americans complete the study. And so now I'll give you some background information about the types of participants we had, starting with national origin. So as you can see here, we had a very diverse array of national origins represented. So the largest representation was Egyptian at 18%, and that is followed by Jordanian at 16%. But again, our sample was kind of from all over. So give me a second to look at that. And surprisingly, because we don't usually see this in research, 83% of the sample were men and 16% were women. And then less than 2% were either agender, which means not identifying with any gender, or gender fluid, which refers to identifying with more than one gender. And in terms of religion, we see that there's also quite a bit of diversity. So the largest percentage was Muslim at 24%, and that was followed by atheists at 22%. But again, as you can see here, we have quite a bit of diversity in terms of religion as well. So lots of different representation across different groups.
Great, thank you for that breakdown, Dr. McCowie. So now we're going to discuss which measurement tools we use to assess these experiences. And so we essentially asked our sample to respond to a series of surveys and questions to better understand some of the questions that we had. We first started with exploring the frequency of exposure to genocide. We used the War-Related Media Exposure Scale, which asked individuals to respond how frequently, on average, per day or over the past 2 weeks, did they spend seeing the following types of war-related content. They provided a different list on TV, radio, newspapers, magazines, or the internet, and they provide some examples of different platforms like Instagram or TikTok. On this screen here, you can see an example item, which included threats of attacks against civilian populations. And participants noted if they were not exposed to this at all the way up to more than 5 hours per day. Now, we also asked about suicidal thought severity using the cultural assessment of risk for suicide. Just to give you an example of the questions asked in this measure, a sample item included, I have, without anyone's knowledge, thought of suicide in the past. I'm just going to wait for that to populate on the slide. Great, perfect. And participants were asked to respond on this scale with how much they agree with the statement. So from strongly disagree all the way to strongly agree. And then we assessed symptoms of depression using the Center of Epidemiological Studies depression scale. Participants were asked to report on their experiences that related to depression in the past week. A sample item would be something like I felt depressed. And participants used the following scales: 0 from rarely or none of the time, all the way up to most of the time, with a 5 to 7 day window as an example. Now, we were also interested in PTSD symptoms, which are really focused on traumatic symptoms. And we used the well-known scale, the PTSD checklist for DSM-5. But for this study, we adapted it for exposure to genocide in Gaza and assessed how bothered individuals were in the past month. So a sample item would be that repeated, disturbing, and unwanted memories of the genocide in Gaza, and individuals would report how bothered they were by those symptoms, from not at all to extremely. For activism, we similarly adapted a measure to be specific to Palestine. And a sample item would be engaging in a boycott, boycotting a product for political reasons specific to the Palestinian cause. And individuals will rate how likely they were to engage in that behavior, from extremely unlikely to extremely likely. As we mentioned before, we were interested if level of feeling like you belong to the Arab American community would be an important factor. So we adapted the scale to be more focused on the Arab American community. Individuals were asked to answer a list of statements, keeping the Arab American identity in mind, using the scale that you see there on the screen. And an example item would be, in general, I feel at home when I am with Arab Americans.
All right. All right, could you hear me? Just want to make sure each time because my mute button is far away now.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. All right. So thank you, Dr. Eldajani, for explaining all of those surveys. So after everyone completed all of these surveys, we then downloaded the data and we analyzed the data to answer our research questions. So just a reminder that our first question was, what is the impact of exposure to genocide content on Arab Americans' mental health? So broadly, we found that Arab Americans who were viewing genocide content more frequently also reported higher levels of depression, suicidal thoughts, and PTSD symptoms. So now we'll kind of show you a visual representation of these results. So here is kind of a heat map that shows these associations. So the more strongly and positively associated two variables were, the more red they were, so that red color. And then the more green, the deeper the green, the more negatively associated two variables were. So a positive association means that as one thing goes up, the other one goes up, and a negative association means that as one thing goes up, the other thing goes down. So we see here, when we look at this exposure to genocide content, we see that exposure to genocide content was associated with more suicidal thoughts, more depression, and more PTSD, so those traumatic stress symptoms. And then, of course, as we would expect, all of those mental health symptoms are also strongly associated with each other. So the more that folks experience traumatic stress, the more they experience depression as well. So we also see that activism was associated with worse mental health. So the more that individuals engaged in that activism that Dr. Eldajani was just talking about, the more they reported suicidal thoughts, depression, and also PTSD. But we see the opposite effect for belongingness. So the more that folks endorsed belonging, the less suicidal thoughts they reported and the less depression they experienced. But belongingness was not associated with traumatic stress symptoms. So whereas activism was associated with more suicide, more depression, more PTSD, belonging was associated with less suicidal thoughts and less depression symptoms.
All right, thank you for that breakdown. So now we're going to go on to some of our other questions. And as a reminder, we were interested in the following. Does the impact of genocide content on mental health outcomes differ based on level of activism? So here we expected to find that higher levels of activism might, in a way, protect Arab Americans from the harmful effects of being exposed to genocide content at more frequent levels. However, unexpectedly, we actually found that across all of our mental health outcomes, so depression, suicidal thoughts, and traumatic stress symptoms, activism did not change the negative effects of genocide exposure on mental health outcomes. So generally speaking, activism did not protect against more exposure to genocide content when it came to adverse mental health outcomes. Now, the other question we were interested in is focused on belongingness. So does the impact of genocide content on mental health outcomes differ based on level of belongingness to the Arab American community? And here we did find that there were differences based on level of belongingness, specifically for suicidal thoughts. And I'll show you a visual representation of what we found here. All right, so first I just want to orient you all to the graph. So on the bottom side here, we have exposure to genocide content. And then on the left side, we have suicidal thought severity. So the greater the numbers, the more severe those suicidal thoughts were. And at the bottom, as you go further to the right, where it says +1 SD, that means more exposure to genocide content. As you're further to the left, that means less exposure to genocide content. Now, you'll also see that belonging legend on the side, and that's split into 3 different lines. The red one symbolizes the people who are lower in feelings of belonging to the Arab American community. The black line symbolizes those with average levels of feeling like they belong to the Arab American community. And the green line highlights people who have a higher sense of belonging. So we'll go through the results at each level of exposure to genocide content. So let's first focus on Arab Americans with lower exposure to genocide content. For these individuals, lower feelings of belonging, so that red line that you see right at the top, was related to higher suicidal thought severity. This is compared to individuals who had average levels of feeling like they belong or high levels of feeling like they belong to the Arab American community. So that's that black line and that green line. And those folks had far lower levels of suicidal thought severity. But this is specific to individuals with low levels of exposure to genocide content. Next, we're going to look at Arab Americans with average exposure to genocide content. For these individuals, lower feelings of belonging, so that red line, results in actually a slight dip in suicidal thought severity when compared to those individuals with low levels of belonging and low exposure to genocide content. However, for individuals with average or high levels of belonging, so that black line and that green line, you see an increase in suicide thought severity levels as genocide exposure increases from low to average levels of exposure to genocide. And finally, let's look at Arab Americans with high exposure to genocide content. For these individuals, lower feelings of belonging, so again, that red line, meant even lower suicidal thought severity. So for individuals who did not feel like they belonged with the Arab American community and had high levels of exposure to genocide content, they had lower suicidal thought severity. Something interesting happens, however, between individuals with average levels of belonging, so that black line, and high levels of belonging, that green line. For those with average levels of feeling like they belong in the Arab American community, high exposure to genocide content meant even higher levels of suicidal thought severity. So you see that black line continues to go up. For those with high levels of belonging, that green line, however, their severity on suicidal thoughts is the same, regardless of whether they have average or high exposure to genocide content. So essentially, this suggests that belongingness might protect against the harmful effects of genocide exposure, but only at those really high levels of feeling like you belong within the community and at those very high levels of genocide exposure. So to summarize, higher levels of belongingness were related to lower suicidal thought severity at very low levels of exposure to genocide content. When that exposure to content went up, belongingness was not as protective against the harmful effects of witnessing genocide as we were expecting. But at those really high levels of feeling like you belong to the Arab American community, and at those really high levels of exposure to genocide content, feeling like you belong in the community did buffer against the negative effects of exposure to genocide content.
All right. Well, thank you so much for breaking down those results about belongingness. So what does all of this tell us? So as we saw, exposure to genocide was associated with worse mental health outcomes, including suicidal thoughts, depression, and especially those traumatic stress symptoms, the PTSD symptoms. So I think many of us have kind of needed to go about life as normal. And I think what this is showing us is that many of us have actually really been struggling quite a bit this year. And that's directly tied to how much we are consuming content related to the genocide. We also saw that activism was associated with worse mental health as well. And again, this was particularly the case for PTSD. So even though activism in general and past research has been found to be protective and meaningful for people, our results show that it does come at a cost. So it's not in our head. This really is exhausting. This really is depressing. And this really is traumatizing to engage in that activism work. And I think our belongingness findings suggest that it might be helpful to foster belongingness within Arab American communities. So for example, creating spaces like this one where Arab Americans can connect, share experiences, and have space to develop that shared sense of identity and community. And of course, it's easier to do that in some places and not others. So I know in Michigan that's probably easier to do in person, but of course there's lots of virtual spaces to do that as well. And so like Wissam was mentioning, these are very preliminary results, and we have lots and lots of next steps that we wanted to kind of share our next steps related to research specifically. So in this presentation, we focus mostly on mental health, but we also know that there has been a cost for many of us for speaking up related to Palestine. So even when Dr. El-Dajani and I were talking about what we were going to say, there's kind of like this intense anxiety and fear about, being misunderstood, worrying that we're going to, be misrepresented, that this will fall in the wrong hands. And this feeling of always having to kind of watch yourself when all you're trying to do is advocate for Palestinian liberation and, for civilians to not die, right? And so as part of the study that we were referring to earlier, we also are creating a new measure that assesses how much Arab Americans have to kind of engage in this self-censorship or keeping silent even when you don't want to in the school and work environment around Palestine advocacy specifically. So we hope in the very near future, like the next few weeks, hopefully, that we will be able to explore this and just see how that self-censorship when it comes to Palestine can impact Arab Americans' mental health. And so in our study, we made kind of an implicit assumption that Arab Americans have the same experiences, but of course, some of us have more privilege and proximity to power than others. So for example, Black Arab Americans experience both anti-Blackness within and outside of the Arab community, as well as anti-Arab sentiment on top of that. Similarly, LGBTQ plus Arab Americans experience multiple intersecting systems of oppression. So it's really important to examine these unique experiences for subgroups of Arab Americans. Third, we prioritized collecting this data rather quickly because we wanted to capture Arab Americans' experience during this historical moment. So doing so meant that we couldn't conduct kind of these in-depth interviews to really understand the lived experiences of Arab Americans during this time. So in our next project, we're going to be focusing on using more in-depth interviews of Arab Americans that will provide a more holistic picture and maybe can help us understand some of our unexpected findings regarding activism and also belongingness. So really try to ask people directly, okay, well, what does this look like for you? You know, what does this mean to you? As opposed to only having the survey instruments that we used. And we also think that it will be important for future research to examine how non-Arab American communities can be the most effective allies possible to Arab Americans. And so really trying to figure out how can we motivate people to engage in this advocacy? How can we move away from this idea of Palestine being the exception to all of our social justice efforts and kind of really helping people see the connection between Palestinian liberation struggle and other social justice issues. So we certainly hope to explore that in future research. And so now thinking about next steps for us as Arab American, as an Arab American community. So, you know, we know that engaging in pro-Palestine advocacy is so important for many of us, and it's really closely tied to our values. You know, I think many of us grew up in families that are, you know, engage in politics. It's a part of many of our lives, and so engaging with this is normal. And what we have to do is kind of figure out ways to make it sustainable for ourselves, right? So we can't, for many of us, it's hard and undesirable to completely ignore what's going on in order to protect our mental health. And at the same time, we also can't kind of engage in it all the time to the point that our mental health is deteriorating, right? So we have to find a way to do the work of advocacy and not, you know, ruin ourselves in the process. So how do we make it sustainable? And although this year has been extremely painful for many of us, like we've been talking about, we of course have a lot of privilege in being in the West, right? And so no matter how hard things have been, of course, being in Gaza is where, you know, things are tremendously worse. And so we have to find ways to continue to have radical hope. We can't give up, and we have to figure out how to use our voice to advocate for our siblings in Palestine. And finally, we have seen extremely powerful allyship from other marginalized groups, including Black Americans and LGBTQ members. And it's just really helpful for us to remember the connections between our struggles and kind of tap into this shared understanding of oppression and desire for liberation. So as Arab Americans, we have to continue to fight anti-Blackness in our communities and fight against anti-LGBTQ plus discrimination and focus on uplifting all marginalized groups. So we really have to kind of lean into recognizing the connections between our struggles and advocate for liberation for all.
Thank you, Dr. Makawi, for closing us out in that summary. So at this point, we just really want to ensure that we acknowledge all the people that helped with this research. So we want to thank our research team that's including Ghadir Habib, Jude Al-Bakari, and Mackenzie Bewley. We also want to thank the participants who took part in the study and were willing to respond to these incredibly difficult questions at a really difficult time. Finally, we want to thank you, Wissam, for inviting us to speak today. And thank you, Dr. Ajami, for being with us today and introducing your work with us as well, and to each and every one of you in the audience at this moment. So thank you all so much, and we're happy to take questions at this time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yara and Dr. Nadia. I will leave the first interjection to Ambassador Dr. Ali, and then I have a few questions for you. You're muted, Doctor. Just unmute yourself, please.
Okay. So I have one major question to both doctors, our guests. Now, with the results you've concluded by this research, do you think that the Arab American community needs help regarding the mental health? And if the answer is yes, what have you done for that? For both, any of you.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, and Dr. Makawi, please jump in as well. It's hard to say just broadly the needs of the Arab American community, because we looked at things kind of in this aggregate form. We put everybody together in a model, and there are so many unique experiences. But we were really struck by how high the mental health distress was in this sample. So we didn't present these findings, but just looking at the severity of the symptoms based on responses to these scales, we saw that they were incredibly high. So this highlighted to us, as Dr. Makawi mentioned, that many Arab Americans are struggling in this current moment in time. I imagine this is definitely related to the exposure to witnessing a genocide live streamed, but also, Dr. Ajami, to your point, to feeling neglected, feeling ignored, and feeling dehumanized in the West by the lack of really any efforts to stop the genocide as we are seeing it. And so I can only say from those findings that I do think many Arab Americans are struggling and do need to focus on their mental health. What that looks like is difficult to know from these findings. It wasn't something that we explored. For many individuals, the kind of traditional Western model of mental health might not be fitting. And so it might be leaning on community, might be having a space where they can openly talk about their struggles with their mental health in a shared, safe space of others who can understand them. If they choose to work with a therapist in that more kind of traditional format, it's really important to pick somebody who will understand the current unique experience that is ongoing for that particular individual. One thing we spoke about together before we hopped on the live broadcast is how so many Arab Americans are also bringing with them direct experiences of warfare that are being triggered by being exposed to this content. And so it would be so important to have a therapist that understands that experience instead of somebody who will not have that shared level of understanding, at which point that could potentially actually be harmful. So that's speculative because we don't have the data for it, but that's kind of when I'm bringing my clinical hat in, where I think it might be helpful. And Dr. Makawi, please feel free to jump in.
Yeah. Well, I completely agree with everything that Dr. Al-Dajani just said. And just to kind of build on the last point that she was making about traditional mental health, I think one of the things that we have been trying to do is really think about psychology's role in all of this and how psychological organizations can advocate both directly against the genocide, but also really trying to help people understand what this experience is like. So I think there are a lot of therapists who have been like, oh, like, why would I bring up politics in a therapy session, right? Or kind of like reducing everything that's happening to like an inappropriate politics, like this has nothing to do with therapy. And I think part of our work is trying to kind of make systemic changes and really help psychologists of all backgrounds really understand why this is relevant for many of us, why this isn't, it's not just like you just turn off the news and you can pretend that it's not happening. It's like when we are witnessing this, for many people, especially for Palestinian Americans, it's like it's happening to your family. It's not this distant, it's not like a distant thing that you can just turn off. And so it's really important for people within our field to really understand that unique experience and figure out how to effectively bring it into the therapy space so that their Arab Americans clients feel supported and understood, and that their experiences are not minimized and invalidated, which I think can contribute to feeling that dehumanization that we were talking about earlier.
Thank you both. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nadia. If you stop any Arab American in the streets of Dearborn and you ask them what kind of war trauma do you have, most probably you will hear a story from them. Those who came from Lebanon or Palestine will tell you stories of the trauma they've experienced under the occupation or attacks of Israel, and those who come from other regions will have those stories to tell. And then there's the triggering part that is now this war is causing for them, but also for the newer generation or the Arab Americans who were born here or have not been exposed before. Even that, and even for non-Arab Americans who are also exposed to, we are focusing on Arab Americans, but this also has general effects on any population that witnesses genocide, because this is unprecedented. We haven't seen a genocide unfold on our phones before, especially on less censored platforms like TikTok, which is correlated with more of a younger generation, Gen Z and below. So I know that I can't, for example, stop my children or control what the algorithms is exposing them to. But what can I tell them as far as how to handle it or think about it, or how do you process what's unfolding, especially with the very loud silence that we live in. And then you have the contrast. People come out and speak about other subjects in the midst of what's going on in the Middle East. Most of the time sounds silly, to tell you the truth, or sounds irrelevant, which also has its psychological effects on our children. What can we tell them how to process this information, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a perfect answer of this is the right thing to say to every child at every single developmental level. And, my kids are 3.5 and 5 months, so a little too young, not too old to start to talk about this. But I think in general, and again, depending on developmental stage, how old the child is, I think focusing on both emotion regulation skills and also thinking about how to continue to have hope and think about what can be done. So I think with the emotion part, I think making space for the emotion. So instead of telling kids, don't worry about it, or like, this is just the way things are, making space for that sadness, right? And sitting with it and learning to tolerate it, modeling what it looks like to tolerate it rather than kind of pushing it away or trying to intellectualize it in some way. So I think focusing on that. And then I think the other thing is also, what can be done. It can be so easy to feel hopeless. I think many of us have experienced a lot of hopelessness in the past year. But as Dr. Eldajani has reminded me multiple times, hopelessness doesn't help the cause, right? It doesn't benefit us to give up. It doesn't benefit Palestinians to give up. And so I think focusing on what can be done and recognizing that even though it can feel hopeless, continuing to engage is worth it.
Yeah, I completely agree with those thoughts. I think that, this is more from my personal experiences, but trying to find ways that I can contribute, even if sometimes it feels small, has been immensely helpful. So doing this research, for instance, of course, sometimes difficult. So seeing how much the community is struggling, but also being able to share those findings. And to Dr. McCowie's point, use those findings to push our own colleagues in our field to do better. So even for younger children, it might be finding narratives, finding stories, finding activities that make them feel a little bit more in control of what they can do and what change they can effect. But there's truly no way to make the mental health distress disappear, because really it is normal. It is normal for us to feel depressed, to feel traumatized, to be triggered by all of this just live streaming of this content. So the goal should not be to make it disappear. The goal should be, how do I not fold in on myself so I can't continue to do the things that are important when fighting for Palestinian liberation, when continuing my day-to-day activities. So how do I build a life, bear witness, sit with the painful symptoms and painful feelings, because those are completely normal, and keep going. And I wish we had the best answer for you. It's so hard to have a clear path forward. But I think really normalizing the experience is very big. And one other piece, I remember stumbling on a video of a Arab psychotherapist who talked about the importance of bearing witness, and also said that it's really a balance of how to do it. Going into that online space, being very mindful of the content that you're going to see, of the difficult images that are going to pop up on your screen, and knowing that that's what you're going to be exposed to, instead of doing it in a way without that prior knowledge, where you might be really surprised by the disturbing images. So going into that space with the knowledge of, I am purposefully bearing witness to the ongoing genocide, and then knowing when you need to pause and then re-engage. And I found that that was a really helpful framework.
Thank you.
Wissam, can I pop in for a question, please, Wissam?
Sure, Doctor. Sure.
Yeah. Dr. Yara and Dr. Nadia, we in Michigan, it's not a secret that it is the main stronghold of the Arab Americans, mainly in Dearborn Heights and Metro Detroit area. We are facing a real problem down here. I don't know if it's the same where you live or all over the states. There is no unity among the community. Do you think this aspect affects any way to deal with trauma, with the problem that's affecting the community due to the genocide going on in Gaza and in Lebanon now? No unity. No unity. Just to be frank enough, no unity. How does this affect anything to be done? Any plans to be executed?
Yeah, I think this is so important to highlight, and thank you for bringing that to this discussion. I think going back to our findings on feeling like you belong in the Arab American community, that's going to have a huge impact on being able to lean on one another during this time where it's difficult sometimes to connect with people who understand what you're going through, particularly, as Dr. McCowie noted, on that day-to-day basis where everybody seemingly is going on with their lives as if nothing is going on. Being able to lean on community is so hugely important. It sounds like they're, going back to like, what are the next steps for our community? That we need to do some exploration within the community. Why is there a lack of unity? What is going on within the community that's become a barrier to unifying? And then how can we address that so that we can lift each other up during this incredibly traumatic time? Dr. McCowie, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I completely agree with what you just said. And, I think finding ways to have more unity is important, and also finding ways to tolerate lack of unity and disagreement amongst us. So even though we might not all be on the same page about strategy, are there still ways to connect? And is there ways for us to tolerate the fact that there's always going to be a lot of diversity within Arab American communities, and there's never going to be perfect unity? Like we're just, too diverse, just like any other ethnic community. And so finding ways to tolerate that and still kind of work together and focus on the things that we all do care about.
Thank you, Doctor. By the way, you've had this. You've taken a measure of the different sub-ethnic groups that the Arab American community belongs to. Perhaps the sample is small to expose any drastic differences, but just out of curiosity, did you find any drastic differences? I mean, it's natural to have some differences, but is there any drastic differences depending on how does an Arab American identify as far as the trauma from this war, without mentioning nationalities, but just did you find any or not?
We have not looked yet. That was my answer. Dr. Abdul-Jani, were you going to say that too? We have lots of data analyses planned, but we haven't. I could imagine there being some differences for sure. I think, especially when you think about just geographical regions, some countries in the Middle East have had more direct conflict with Israel than others. And so, you can imagine that there could be more of a sense of shared connection with Palestine, kind of depending on national origin for that reason. But we don't know yet. We'll keep you posted.
Great. Another question about that feeling. I mean, this is feelings that are embedded in humans for a reason. And sometimes we deal with that kind of feeling by becoming active, feeling that we want to change what's going on, and that drives us into activism. From your research, it shows that activism is actually going to increase the mental challenges. So for how can we make activism more sustainable? We've discussed it among activists, like, do we watch the news? Like, for example, watching Western media for me is very stressful because of the bystander and the ignoring of what's going on, or I guess the bias, the obvious bias in it. So I avoid watching that. Some of us have avoided listening to news during the day. They just get the summary at the end of the day. I don't know. It doesn't seem to help much. It maybe helps a little bit. We're trying to find ways to cope. Is there any ideas of how can an activist cope with this continuous stress?
Well, I mean, I think that there's lots of individual level strategies that that people can try to cope, like using mindfulness strategies, like all sorts of specific psychological strategies. But I think the bigger picture here is that part of what makes the activism so hard, I think, is really that fear of it being misunderstood and misperceived. And so I think from a systemic level, we have to really focus on ways to protect pro-Palestine speech and to remove censorship, to make it so that, speaking up for Palestine doesn't mean that you're at risk of losing your job or losing opportunities. So I think we have to figure out ways, and especially with the help of our allies, to make it safer to participate in pro-Palestine advocacy, because I do think that's a really big part of it. Of course, the activism itself can be really hard, but that constant stress about what's going to happen, that vigilance about everything that you say, I think also plays a really big role in those negative mental health consequences as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to add to that as well, and of course, this is kind of my own personal experience, so not based on the findings. But I think sometimes what I find helpful is a reminder that this is going to be an ongoing struggle. it's a long path forward. Inshallah, the genocide will end soon. And after that, we still need to continue to fight for change, right? We cannot go back to the siege, the occupation, the constant trauma in Palestine. So this is a very long road. And sometimes I need to remind myself of that to kind of reduce expectations that in this moment, I'm going to make a huge change. It's slowly building for change that will come down the line. Now, another thing that I always remind myself of is, even though that's true, I have also seen huge change in this past year. Living in, my family and I moved to Canada first, and now I'm here. But living in North America since I was 9 years old, going from not ever being able to speak about Palestine really, and it being so misunderstood, to now more people learning about our history and the Nakba and settler colonialism and those places is very hopeful in a very dark time. And so I really remind myself of those moments when I find that hopelessness that Dr. Makawi talked about is creeping in. And then looking at other kind of bigger things that are changing, like the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and the huge impact that they've had. And I find that those reminders are really helpful. Again, it can't erase the pain because that pain is very normal, but it can help sustain the activity as we move forward. So that's kind of just been my own experience of how do I try to keep going when I find myself sinking in a little bit.
Wissam, just let me elaborate a little bit about what Dr. Nadia just mentioned. I believe if there is something positive of what's going on, is this, that, I mean, rarely before anybody could speak about Palestine in public. Demonstrators in the universities, huge rallies. This had never happened before. I think this genocide that is still going on in our part of the world just opened the eyes mainly of the new generation in the United States and the West. And this is, I believe, it is the positive side of all this genocide happening. Thank you.
I have a couple more questions. Maybe we can wrap up afterwards. One is, uh, when I had children, I started sympathizing more with parents, of having more feelings and sympathy to other children, because I don't know, something in my brain made me feel the same way I feel about my children to them. So we have that mechanism of mirror nerves, or whatever the scientific terms for it are. Do you think also having experienced a genocide that is close to us will make us sympathize with other people who are exposed to the same trauma, and also make us work together? And that's perhaps another positive aspect, is unifying, that shared and media type of genocide will also create a shared experience by the word that will hopefully create more sympathy and connection towards each other.
I definitely think that is something that can happen. Ideally, one does not have to directly experience something in order to gain that empathy, but I do think that is something that could happen as a result of this. And noting other genocides in other countries, thinking about what's happening in Sudan, thinking about all of these struggles, and whatever route gets us there, I think is okay, and I do hope that that'll be an outcome, that we're able to see it's like the same processes of groups having disproportionate power and basically being able to get away with anything because of the power and money that they have. So definitely a lot of shared struggles in that regard.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit, just seeing content online about those particular discussions of people noting how they connect to the liberation struggle in Palestine because of their own liberation struggles, whether that's in the US specifically or in their respective countries of origin. There's a lot of those lines being drawn. And I hope that if other people's eyes weren't open to the liberation struggles of others in the past, that they will be now. I'm often also inspired by anti-Zionist Holocaust survivors talking about how their experience in the Holocaust directly mirrors what they're witnessing in Gaza, and how that is why they keep fighting against the system that is saying that they're doing this in their name, right? So I think when we can bridge those struggles together, we become so much more powerful in fighting for justice and fighting for freedom. So I hope that that is the case.
Yes, thank you. And one of those who speak as an example of what you're saying is Dr. Jill Stein, the presidential candidate for Green Party herself, shares that her family's experience in the Holocaust is the result that she is taking a very strong stance against what's going on in Palestine. My final question to you, doctors, is the process of getting this research done, and whatever procedures there are to get the university to sponsor or agree to such research. I'm sure that you had to also go through some of what your research is about, the fear of censorship, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of being misconstrued. So can you share with us some of that experience and it takes a little bit of struggle and sacrifice and courage to do what you want to do in that sense.
Yeah, I'm happy to share a little bit. So in terms of our experience with this research project specifically, I'll say surprisingly, there wasn't a huge barrier. And I actually wonder if we had a bit of a secret ally in one of the offices when we applied for this research. We asked for it to be expedited because of the timeliness of the questions, and there were no questions asked. They made sure to have this work expedited so that we could look at these really important outcomes as soon as possible. Where we've struggled more so is broadly talking about Palestine, period, outside of this research. And I think many individuals across higher education institutions have really struggled with that. There has definitely been moments of being misconstrued, misrepresented in what we were trying to say or do when just trying to speak about these experiences. When trying to simply highlight that we're struggling, which I think adds to that mental health burden where we feel like we have to pretend like everything is okay and pretend like we're just going about our day to day to protect the feelings of others, which is just so backwards in this moment. So I think that's particularly where we've struggled, not so much with this research, but just being able to openly talk about our experiences, openly talk about oppression, settler colonialism, liberation struggles, all of those pieces. And unfortunately, it's had the pretty big consequence of drawing big divides within our institutions that have still not been remedied. So we continue to struggle with that until today. Dr. McCauley, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you described everything perfectly in terms of both, the research study and then now kind of getting to the harder part, and we don't know, we're working on several papers now. We don't know whether they're going to be accepted. There's all sorts of potential struggles in the future. And I think the important thing is that it is really hard. And Dr. Eldajani and I, we both kind of talked about how it feels risky to even, talk about this publicly. And at the same time, knowing that the more of us that speak up, the less scary it is for a single person to speak up, and how, this is necessary. It's necessary to work through the fear as much as you can. and be willing to face some consequences. As hopefully with the help of our allies, we can make it so that it's not so negatively consequential to speak up for Palestine and to engage in pro-Palestine advocacy.
Well, thank you. We think that your research is very, very important to us as Arab Americans. It's very important for the country. We value it, and we encourage you and stand with you and support you in what you're doing. And if you need a letter of support from our center, I'm sure that the board will be happy to provide one. I want to thank you again for being with us in the program. I'll leave the final word to Ambassador Dr. Ali Ajami.
Yeah, really, we were so happy with your presence, Dr. Yara, Dr. Nadia. It's so amazing what you have done. We hope that this type of researches will be widely implemented. And please consider this platform, our platform, as yours. Anything you need to come up, we are here. Thank you very much for being with us. I would like to thank everybody who was watching us. And please, we are continuing with this program. We will not stop it. We have already done 28 episodes of this program, Arab American history of Arab-Israeli conflict, and we will move on. Thank you very much, and I wish that this genocide on Gaza will stop soon, although I don't think so. I don't think so. We hope. We can do nothing but hope. Thank you very much, Dr. Nadia, Dr. Yara, Mr. Wissam Sharafuddin, and see you soon. Thank you very much. Bye.
See you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.